Good afternoon and welcome to another Talmix broadcast. We're back with yet another really good one this afternoon, and it's all about you as the self-employed individual, really relating to a change of legislation coming into practice in April this year. We're going to be talking about how this affects you and how you need to get yourself ready, and whether you need to be compliant to the change. My name is Katie Roberts, as you probably know, and I work very closely with the Talmix team, and it's great to be back here for another hangout. This event, just as a reminder, is being recorded, so if you do want to watch it again, it will be available on the Talmix website or on our YouTube channel just afterwards. Feel free to share it with people that you think is relevant. And if you want to live chat with us, you can feel free to do that under the Talmix chat hashtag as well. And we'll do our best to answer any questions that might come through on social in today's session. It's jam-packed, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking unnecessarily. I want to get to the heart of why we are here today. So if you are self-employed, then obviously this broadcast today is especially for you. Legislation is changing, which means that the way that you, as a self-employed person, pays tax could be changing too. In the UK specifically, the IR35 legislation amendment comes into play in April 2017. So that's this April this year. And I'm really happy to have an expert on the subject matter joining me today, who certainly knows a lot more about it than I do. Andrew Chamberlain is the Deputy Director of Policy and External Affairs with IPSE, the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed. Andrew, thank you so much for your time and for joining me today on this hangout.
Thanks for having me, Katie. It's good to be here.
Excellent. So let's get started. Andrew, what is the IR35 legislation and why is it changing?
The intermediaries legislation, or IR35 as it's more commonly known, is anti-avoidance legislation. It is targeted at people who work for themselves, mainly through their own limited company. So if you're an incorporated body, either you work through a limited company, it affects you. And what it tries to do is distinguish between businesses which are generally in business on their own account and those which are operating more like an employee. And if it's determined that that engagement, that IR35 applies to any particular engagement, then it changes the tax treatment for that engagement. And effectively, you'll have to pay more tax, usually retrospectively, on the engagement that you've done.
So what are the key issues around the changing of this legislation? And more importantly, why are people really concerned about the changes and how they might affect them?
The change affects public sector contracts only. So it's important that we make that clear straight away. So if you're working in the private sector or with a private sector client, then the change doesn't affect you at the moment, and there is some questions over whether in due course that will change. But the public sector change is that currently it's up to the contractor themselves to decide whether or not IR35 should apply to their engagements. In the public sector, from this April, the client is going to have the liability of determining whether IR35 should apply. And if it thinks it should apply, it will tax the contractor at source through the RTI system, real-time information system. In other words, it will tax a contractor business, a limited company, as if that company were an employee, or very much like that company were an employee. So it's quite a radical change.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
We at IPSE spent the majority of last year campaigning very hard against the change. We think that it's going to be very bad news and cause a lot of difficulties, not just for contractors, but for the public sector as well. And we believe that public sector projects will stall, that the delivery of the delivery of public services will stall. And we think that the government hasn't really considered the consequences of what it's doing with this. I can go into that more now if you like, or we can.
Yeah, I mean, let's chat about it. Let's get into that detail for a second. I'm sure there's a lot, as you mentioned, if you guys were campaigning for one side of it, I'm sure there's a lot of diverse opinion about on why the changes and why the UK government is doing this, etc. So tell me a little bit more about your opinion on this, and is it a good idea?
Well, it's not a good idea. The government want to do it because they perceive that there's a problem with what they call disguised employment. This is where someone, looks as if they're an employee, but in fact they're operating via a limited company or an intermediary, hence the term intermediaries legislation. And the result is that less tax is paid to the exchequer. And the government is concerned, particularly, I suppose, to me, it doesn't make much sense why there should be one set of rules in the public sector different to the private sector. But I suppose they're concerned that, they believe there's a problem within public sector organisations where there's this going on. And they believe that this change will tighten up the rules and make it less likely that people will be sort of not complying with the IR35 legislation. So that's their motivation for doing it. We would question, one, how much non-compliance is really going on. They seem to think, it's quite a big problem. They haven't given us any figures or haven't given us any reasoning for how they've come to that conclusion. We are pretty sure that the problem is not nearly as widespread as they think it is, because one of the sort of central problems with IR35 is that it's very difficult to know whether it applies or it doesn't apply. And that's why you have a lot of big arguments over, even one engagement. It will go to a tribunal and it can then go to an appeal, and that can overturn the decision because it's somewhat subjective. And there's all these different factors that they look at. For example, is the personal service of that individual required, or can that person send a substitute? If they can send a substitute, it's a pointer away from IR35 and away from employment. And there's other things as well, like control. How much control does the client have over how the work is being done? So if you're an employee, you might be used to your boss saying, I don't want you to do it like that, I want you to do it like this. Well, as a contractor, you're more likely to say, you want this done, and this is how I'm going to do it, because this is, in my professional opinion, the best way to do it. And then, you could then terminate my contract if you're not happy with the way I've done the work. But you're not really going to tell me how to do it. I'm the expert here, and I'm going to do it. So these are the type of factors that they look at. But by the time you consider all of this, it's a very murky, messy picture, and it takes a lot of things to wade through it. And therefore, no one can really be absolutely 100% certain that the engagement is either inside or outside of IR35. And because of this, you can get differences of opinion on how big a problem non-compliance is. HMRC think there's all these IR35 court engagements in the public sector that aren't declaring or applying IR35 as they should do. And others would argue, well, in fact, the problem's not that big, because they take the view that, what makes an engagement court. Others would say, well, actually, it's not court. So that's one problem. And secondly, the mechanism that they're using to make this change, i.e. to get the client to decide whether or not it should apply. And if the client gets it wrong, by the way, the client becomes liable for the tax. So you end up with a situation where you've got very, very unclear legislation and rules and how they work. You've got a client who might have, say, 100, maybe 1,000 engagements at any one time, that they now have to do this quite complex decision on whether or not it's court or not. And if they get it wrong, then they're not complying and they can get penalised by HMRC. So there's a bit of an incentive for them just to say everyone is court, because it's so complicated and difficult to do. So that means you're now going to have over-compliance, and you're going to have a lot of contractors who are saying, this is not fair. I am definitely not operating as an employee. I'm having this tax regime imposed on me unfairly, and therefore I'm going to leave. I'm going to terminate the contract. I'm not going to settle for it, particularly as I can go into the private sector and work there where these somewhat ridiculous rules don't apply. So there's going to be an incentive for people to leave, or perhaps put up their rates to account for the extra
additional tax they have to pay. Yeah.
So what we end up in is a situation where vital projects, suddenly people walk out, and or people say, well, I will stay, but only if you deal with a big raise in my rates. So it's going to cost the taxpayer more money in the long run. Because in the end, the other thing I should say, so just to let me know if I'm going on, sorry.
That's okay.
But the other thing that we think might happen is if you have a vital project and the contractors have walked out, the government's got to keep it going. So they'll turn to big consultancies to get the resource in to do it. And that costs a lot more money as well, because those guys charge quite a lot of money. or you have to pay the contractors that you currently have more money to stay to make up for the loss in tax. So the idea that this is actually going to make revenue, is going to gain revenue for the Exchequer, we think is somewhat flawed. In fact, it's entirely flawed. We think that this could end up costing more money, if anything. So we think there's a lot of problems around the way that they've gone about doing this, and we did do a lot of work and tried to explain to them that this could turn out badly. And it wasn't just us. There was quite a few other business groups as well. You mentioned, what are the other arguments? Well, actually, most groups, business groups and stakeholders who are outside of the government, thought that this was a bit of an ill-conceived idea and wanted HMRC to at least delay implementing this until we'd worked out some of the finer details around how it would all work. And on an autumn statement in November 2016, that's when we found out. And we were somewhat hopeful that they might delay it or put it off or perhaps row back from it a little bit. But unfortunately, they didn't. They've decided to push ahead with it.
So, Andy, let me ask you a quick question for a second. You mentioned a disguised employee. The HMRC speaks about that as well. And a lot of the research that I was doing in preparation for today's broadcast, there was such a lot of information out there that it's really easy to become quite confused. Well, is this me? Is this not me? What is a disguised employee? What do they mean by that?
A disguised employee is someone who is an employee in all but name, if you see what I mean. So someone who's operating on the face of it as a contractor, perhaps operating through a limited company, supplying services through that company, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. But when they're actually in the process of fulfilling the duties of that role, they're really acting like an employee. Perhaps they're part of a team and they have a manager who is very closely controlling what work they do and how they do it. Perhaps the work that they're doing isn't very, very clearly defined, so that in fact they're just doing general bits of work for that client and not being brought in specifically for one project or one use. And perhaps they can't send a substitute. And if you package all this up and you then say, well, actually that person, you could work alongside them and think that they are just an employee, then that's the type of person that IR35 was designed to capture. It's designed to tackle disguised employment. That's what it's there to do, because the taxation treatment is different, you see, and that's what it's there for.
And so what about those contractors who, have agreed to work on long-term projects, for example? Obviously, this change is may come to pass or come to fruition halfway through a contract where fees are already agreed. Yeah. Are we saying, therefore, that contractors are now, who may fall into this category, are now going to be penalized, I say that in inverted commas, or taxed, but they have no ability to be able to adjust their rates necessarily? How does this kind of affect people who have a long-term relationship with set structures in place already with their clients?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult. That's one of the very difficult things of this, is that those engagements which are quite possibly going on right now, the work won't be completed before April. So in April, it might be that the client will start asking a lot of questions around the nature of the engagement and how the contractor is set up and what the tax position is. And it's not necessarily the case that they will do this, but it's quite possible that they will go from saying, we accept that you're a contractor and it's a very clear business to business relationship, to suddenly saying, actually, we're going to start taxing you like you're an employee. But by the way, we're not going to give you any of the associated rights that employees get either. So these contractors will now be paying tax pretty much identically to the way that an employee would be paying it. But they won't be getting the pension contribution or the holiday pay or the sick pay that the employee is getting. So there's a bit of an inherent fairness there as well, which is kind of a whole nother issue. But yes, going back to your original question, that is when I think that we'll see this problem emerge. And it might be at that stage that contractors will say, I don't accept your assessment that this engagement is IR35 court, because perhaps I actually did it. I've been contracting for a while. I know about IR35. I went and got my contract reviewed at the start of this arrangement. You accepted that was a good business-to-business contract. We were all in agreement this was a business-to-business relationship at that time. And I'm not going to accept you now just declaring that it's inside of IR35. So I'm going to terminate the contract. Or you're going to have to do something else to make me feel happy about this, i.e. put my rates up in some way or some other thing. And that's where I think you're going to have this point of conflict. and people may well just walk out, and that's going to be a resourcing problem for the public sector.
And what about those who work on the international sphere, international clients? Is there anything that they need to take into account, or is this not really relevant to them?
If you're a UK taxpayer, the IR35 and working overseas is quite a complex, is another complex thing. But the short answer is that in practice, you don't really need to worry too much about IR35. I sort of say this with, knowing that people out there will probably criticise me for saying it. You should really, of course, be fully compliant with all UK tax law if you're a UK taxpayer, and if the nature of your overseas engagement means that you're paying the tax back in the UK, because sometimes it won't do, depending on where you're working and how long you're working there often. But essentially, IR35 becomes sort of not something that you need to be as concerned about. The reason being is because in order to prove that IR35 should apply, they'd have to get the client involved, and the client's not going to have any idea what IR35 is because they're not based in the UK, and those laws don't apply to them. So it becomes a very difficult thing to prove that IR35 applies to an engagement when you're abroad. So by and large, it's not something that you should be as concerned about. In fact, if you're working abroad, tax generally is a major headache and something that you should be concerned about, but IR35 won't be on the top of your list of priorities to be concerned about.
And then if we take a look at those people who might employ another person, as part of the services that they deliver, and in terms of PAYE structures, etc., is this something that they need to also still take into account if they have, their own?
You have to consider. It may be that your company takes on an employee, and but IR35 could still potentially apply. If you're doing work for someone, and again, it goes back to that: are you acting as if you're an employee? And they look at those tests around personal service control and all of that. The fact that you have an employee somewhere else, well, actually, it's a pretty good pointer to you being in business on your own account. And I think that it could be a factor that might be considered. But technically, IR35 could still apply to your engagement, and you should still make sure all the normal things that you would do, which is make sure you've got a good contract in place, make sure that the working practices are kind of clearly setting out that you're separate from the employees in that organization that you're now working with. And make sure that the client kind of understands that you're not to be treated in the same way as an employee. You're brought in there to do something different, and you will behave in a slightly different way.
And so let's talk, I'm aware that we've got just over 10 minutes left. So let's talk about the actions that people can take to make themselves IR35 safe. Is there anything that individuals can do? What do you suggest? What does IPSE suggest to make sure either you comply or you may, or if you don't necessarily comply? What can you do?
There's a few things that you can do. I mean, there are, for one thing, there are insurance products out there which can help you to fight an IR35 investigation, and IPSE members have that inbuilt into their membership. So it's one of the good advantages that we give to our members. Also, we're there to help them if they do get into any trouble around IR35. If they are being asked questions by HMRC, we can advise them, and we have experts and tax helplines and things like that, which can just help them to keep them up to speed. We also have guides on IR35 and stuff like that. Specifically, what can you do if you're out there? And I mentioned before, getting your contract reviewed. That's a kind of first step. What that means is when you're sent a contract to sign in order to do some work, you could get that contract reviewed by specialists. We do this. There are others out there. And that will tell you whether the contract it's a bit of a sort of industry term, IR35 friendly. In other words, is this a good contract from an IR35 point of view? Does it have nice strong clauses in there about your right to provide a substitute and how there should be a sort of autonomy of the way that you'll do the work will be up to you and that sort of thing. So then we look at all the clauses of the contract and provide an opinion on whether that's a good contract from an R35 point of view or not. And we'll make suggestions over which clauses we think could be strengthened or which clauses you might want to think about including if they're not in there already. That's the first step. Then you also just need to be conscious of how you behave when you're working with the client, particularly if you're working on their site alongside other employees. You want to be a bit careful around, I mean, even small things. I mean, there's a bit of a sort of, this is something of a cliche actually, but I believe it has been considered in investigations is, did you go to the Christmas party? You know, you want to make sure that benefits that are there for the employees are there for the employees, and that you're not partaking or taking advantage of those benefits because you're not an employee. You're a separate business which has been brought in on a business-to-business basis to provide a service, and you want to make sure that's sort of quite clear and clean. You sometimes will find yourself, project managers will find themselves sort of managing a project, which means that they might have to work with teams of people. So there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. But where I think that you should, be a bit careful is around things. I have heard of people being asked to line manage other members of staff, and perhaps do an appraisal and things like that. Now, I believe that that's getting a bit more tricky. You're then worming your way into the fabric of the organisation, in my opinion. As I say, that's just one factor, and there might be lots of other very good factors you have on your side, so which would mean that overall you're not IR35 core. But I think that if you start drifting into that type of behaviour, then you're opening yourself up to a bit of suspicion on an IR35 point of view. There's a rule within IR35 called part and parcel. Are you part and parcel of the organisation? This isn't one of the central pillars of what determines IR35, but it's just another one of those things where if you're deemed to be, really part of the fabric of that organisation, people might expect that to be an employed position. There's a few myths around it too, which we can bust while we're here. It is sometimes thought to be the case that when an engagement reaches a 2-year period, it then becomes more likely to be IR35 core after that. I believe this is tied up with the idea that employees after 2 years get enhanced rights. In other words, they have right to unfair dismissal. Their unfair dismissal rights are enhanced after 2 years. And I think that there's a sort of sense that if a contractor has been there for 2 years, then they too can start claiming some rights, and that the relationship just automatically or perhaps becomes more employment-like. In fact, that's not true. There's nothing about length of tenure in the legislation. You could be there for a very long time. You could be there for years indefinitely, and IR35 is no more likely to apply than it was in your first week. Having said that, of course, I think that most people from a common sense point of view might say, well, if you've been there for 10 years or something, that's not really how we would expect an independent business to be behaving. And that's been your only client. That sounds like it could be employment. And you may therefore be inviting someone to look into you. So, it's not that being there for 10 years is legally, there's any barrier against it legally, but it does perhaps raise eyebrows, should we say.
Certainly getting into murky waters. The lines kind of become a little bit hazy. And just finally, we have a few minutes left. Finally, Andrew, I've also seen people questioning the whole idea of setting themselves up as a limited company. Would this be one way to get around the IR35 legislation? No,
this is what makes you inside it. This is what brings it into scope. So it's really there to tackle limited company contractors or people who incorporate, or the dreaded term, which many people don't like because it's actually not legally defined, is personal service company. But they're referring to the same thing. A person who is a freelancer or a contractor or an independent professional operating their business and incorporating it as a limited company. It's when you get into that the tax regime changes. So you begin to pay corporation tax and now dividend taxation as well. And income tax on top of that too, but you don't pay national insurance contributions. And crucially, the employer doesn't pay national insurance contributions. And I think that's actually where a lot of the tax gap is. It's that employer's NI contribution, which the government feel they're missing if they think this is someone who's just disguising employment. So that's when IR35 comes in to try to challenge your status there. Are you really an independent business providing services to your client, or are you actually just an employee who set yourself up in this sort of artificial arrangement in order to take advantage of a better tax regime for you and the client, because the client doesn't pay the employer's NI in that instance. But in fact, we've done quite a bit of research asking our members, why do you incorporate? And taxation isn't one of the reasons. It is there are some differences in tax, and that can be to the advantage of the individual who's the director of the company. But the reason why people incorporate mainly is because their clients insist on it. You see,
Oh,
if,
really?
if a client wants to do business with someone who's a separate business, they want to make sure that it's a very clear business-to-business relationship, because they don't want any questions to be asked over the employment status of that individual. They don't want someone to suddenly claim unfair dismissal. They don't want to have to contribute to their pension. They're just saying, we really just want you to come in and, for example, design our website, or maybe we want you to come in and make sure every floor of our office has a water cooler in it, and keep those water coolers serviced, and make sure we've got plenty of water topped up in them and all of that. But we want you to, in order for us to have that arrangement, we need you to be a limited company so that you can invoice us, we can pay the invoice. It's very, very clear what's going on. So clients very often will insist on there being a limited company, and that's why people incorporate. It's also good from a protection of personal assets point of view. This is another reason. This is why all businesses incorporate. It gives you the confidence to go forth, get involved in business, and if it does all go wrong, which of course you hope it doesn't, then your personal assets are protected. You're not going to end up losing your house because you've upset a client and they're now asking you for lots of money and things like that. So these are the reasons why people incorporate. Taxation isn't really a consideration. It's only once they incorporate, then they realize they have to deal with tax, and then they realize they've got to deal with IR35, and they didn't get into freelancing to get involved with IR35, and it's a bit of a shock to them when they have to deal with it. So that's part of the problem. Yeah.
And Ian, just final thoughts. How do you see this going? Final thoughts before we.
So I mentioned that at the moment the change is in the public sector only, and there's no difference. There's no change in the private sector. But every independent expert or stakeholder that I've spoken to says that they would expect the government to at least consider rolling the same regime out in the private sector in due course, because it doesn't make any sense to have one regime in the public sector and one regime in the private sector. It makes an already very complicated part of tax legislation even more complicated. So I would expect that might be something that they consider, particularly if you looked at the autumn statement last year. The Chancellor talked about the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibilities findings, that there was a huge increase in incorporations, and that there's this huge increase in self-employment generally, because the technology is making it people able to do it, and more people are finding that's the way they want to work. So lots of people are becoming self-employed. Many of those are incorporating, and the government has realised that this is causing a big hole in the tax that they're getting. So we're expecting them to look more and more in this area, and we do see a lot of further tax changes. And just, if I may, there's also various reviews out at the moment looking at self-employment. The Treasury Select Committee, the Biz Select Committee, DWP Select Committee. DWP have done something on pensions as well with the self-employed recently. And of course, the Matthew Taylor Review, which is perhaps the biggest one of all, which is going to look at what's driving this rise in self-employment. So this is very much under the spotlight, this area at the moment. And the Treasury is certainly looking at it from a tax point of view. So I would expect to see definitely more change in this area, which is, I know, the last thing that everyone wants, because it's so hard to keep up with it. But unfortunately, I do think that the government is going to look at this and continue to tweak around with it and make changes. We actually have some ideas on stuff they could do. I won't bore everyone with that now. But,
that could be helpful for the next broadcast.
Yeah, maybe that's for the next one. But yeah, we expect there'll be more changes on this.
Interesting times ahead. I think certainly when you look at the change in the way that people work, certainly just look at how Talmix is changing the lives of organizations in the way that they work. I think governments are being forced to look at the self-employment issue, the independent consulting issue, and take stock of what's really happening and how the business world is evolving. So interesting times ahead. Andrew, thank you so much for your time today. I really, we could have, again, as always, we could carry on another half an hour on this one, but hopefully we've answered at least the nutshell of some questions. I see we had a good number of viewers watching us today, so thanks very much to all of you who did join us. Again, if you'd like to watch us again, make notes. It will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. We'll also be tweeting some links, etc. afterwards, so it will be available then. We will be holding another broadcast next month, so make sure you keep an eye on your inbox and on Twitter. But Andrew, again, finally, thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it, and look forward to exploring more of this with you next time.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Take care, everybody, and have a good evening. Goodbye.